Hello there. Let's have another consult the doctor. First question. I'm moving fast because I have a lot of ground to cover today. Why do ballpoints not come with removable caps like fountain pens or rollerballs? That's an excellent question. My answer would be this. Because fountain pen ink is water-based and rollerball ink is water-based, and therefore they will evaporate when they are not capped. If you were to have a system like this is a ballpoint, and the nib of a fountain pen would come out like that, and there would be no protective cover there, as is the case in, say, an Namiki Falcon. This light is weird, isn't it? Adjust this a little bit. Sorry, not Namiki. Yeah, no, not Namiki Falcon. A Pilot Vanishing Point. Sorry. A Pilot Vanishing Point is a fountain pen that you click and then a nib comes out, but it has a little trap door that shuts so that that nib and feed are not exposed to air, and it works pretty well. Water-based ink in your fountain pen though. In a rollerball, water-based ink, but a ballpoint uses a different type of ink. It's an oil-based ink. And oil evaporates a little differently from the way water evaporates. So my money is on it has something to do with the ink. There's no real need to protect a ballpoint tip the way you should protect a fountain pen nib or a rollerball tip from drying out. If you have other ideas, then by all means, let me know. This was a question I received through Instagram, and it was a bit of a discussion I had with someone. And her point was something along the lines of, I'm trying to keep it brief, should fountain pen manufacturers make their own nibs to really be called fountain pen manufacturers? And I think there was another argument along the lines of, yes, Jovo or B.R.E for that matter, those nibs are very interchangeable because they're on a lot of pens and you can easily switch them out from one to the next. But that's not the same as a nib that is made in-house and that kind of has that artisanal quality, and then everything is made in-house. Okay, this is one of the questions where I think there's no objective answer, but I think it's a very interesting question. I don't think I'd ever really considered that question, but my view on it would be this. For me, no. I don't think a fountain pen manufacturer has to be able to make their own nibs to be called a fountain pen manufacturer. Is it artisanal to do so? Yes, it is. And that would be the same as a baker making everything from scratch versus a supermarket baker just getting dough and then baking that and then calling it fresh bread. It's still fresh bread, but it's not made entirely from scratch by that baker, right? I also think of interesting, maybe smaller, and I mean that in a completely neutral manner, but just smaller companies. I think of Ian Schoen, of Schoen Design. I think of someone like Ben Walsh from Gravitas Pens. I think these are guys who make incredibly nice pens. They really know their cookies when it comes to creating interesting designs and metalwork. However, bear in mind that knowing how to make a pen out of, in this case, metal, is not the same as also knowing how to make a nib. If you have to make the nib, then do you also have to make the feed? These are different skills that come into play, right? And yes, you can make a nib, but it has to have a certain alloy, and it has to have, I don't think tensile strength is the correct term here, but I'm not a metallurgist, right? You don't want to have a nib that you put a little bit of pressure on and the tines splay and they never bounce back. I don't think that's tensile strength, but I think you know what I mean. It has to have that property. Tell me what that property is called, please. And then you have to make a feed. And what do you make that? Ebonite. I know people. I'm pretty certain that Pierre Miller of Desiderata makes his own feeds. And that's really awesome, out of ebonite. But then I don't believe that he makes his own nibs. So is he then not a full pen maker? And I'm not trying to harp on that point, because I don't think the point really was you can only call yourself a pen maker if, but the point was more so to really be considered a pen maker. Should you, right, make your own nibs? And I don't think so. And what I had to think of when I was collecting my thoughts on this topic was the art of the samurai sword. Samurai swords were not made by one person. There was the blacksmith who made the blade, but then there was also the tsuba maker, who that's the cross guard that that's a cross guard. There was also the handle maker, who would make the handles and would then wrap it. There was stingray skin and there was specific wrapping around it. And then there was also the saya maker, the maker of the scabbard. And maybe there's some other professions that I left out there, because I think that often, maybe not always, but I think often, the sharpener was also a different guy from the blacksmith. Now, does that mean that there were no blacksmiths who could do all of these things? Maybe there were, but it's a division of labor, and I don't think there's anything wrong with sticking to what you know best, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with, say, a Ben Walsh. Sorry, Ben, I'm not picking on you. But making very nice pens and saying, but the nib, the feed, the nib collar, the converter, that stuff I'm going to purchase from someone who knows how to do those things. Say a Bock or say a Jovo, who make these nibs all the time. They're good at it. Let them do that thing, right? Because again, what about the converter? Do you have to make your converters in-house, etc.? I think it's a very interesting question, and I definitely don't want to make light of it, because I think it's very interesting to think about this. So what I'd like to know is, how do you feel about it? Do you think that you should really make nibs in-house? Some companies do, right? Montblanc, I think, still does. Pelican, I think, still does. Aurora does. So, I mean, there are companies who do it, and I do think it's very nice. I absolutely value and appreciate that, but I have never felt, well, here you have a Leonardo, but it only has a Jovo nib. So, I have never felt that way, but I understand that other people might. So I just want to hear your opinion on this as well. I really have to try not to move around so much. It's getting a bit dark, and the cameras, I know the lighting is not great this way. I'm not really showing off any products though, so I think it's going to be okay. Just bear with me. I'm sorry. I also look very red now. I'm not that excited. Okay. I got a fairly long email from someone who purchased a Namiki Emperor. This is a Namiki Emperor. It is a large pen, and this is all relevant, with a large nib, and it has a one-way shut-off valve. Now, I'm not going to read the entire email because it was quite long, but there were a couple of issues. One issue was the pen seemed to dry out, and it seemed to have, I'll put a timestamp here, baby's bottom, because when the person was writing figures 8 quickly, there was skipping. And I'll first get to that question. Is it possible my pen has baby's bottom? Yes. But I can't see the pen, so I don't know if that's really the case. It sounds like it might. Send it to a nibmeister, have it tuned. It's a $2,000 pen. It's probably worth getting that tuned by a professional and then seeing what they can do with it. And I guarantee that if it is baby's bottom, they'll find it and they'll fix it. No questions asked. The more interesting point in this question was this. This is the owner's first one-way shut-off valve pen. I'll get to what that means. And he ran into several issues about opening up the valve, the pen drying out, pen and ink specificity, etc. Okay. For my friends who are not very familiar with one-way shut-off valves, what am I talking about? It's not the same as a piston filler. A piston filler is a pen that has a piston rod, a seal, and as you open up the end, the blind cap, the piston a blank cap you take off, but the piston turning knob, that piston seal moves up and that sucks up ink because it creates a vacuum. This is not a system like that. With a one-way shutoff valve like this is a translucent model. This is an Opus 88 Omar. You can kind of see what's happening. You can stick this in a bottle of ink. You can pull this out, but it's not going to do anything because this is not a seal that creates a vacuum inside. That's not what it's for. Now, what is this system all about? Well, you have an opening in the bottom end of the section. See that? This is the section. Here's the nib end. Here is an opening. And here, in here is, I should not do that one hand so you can actually see it. Here is that piston that moves up and down. Okay? Now, that piston ends, and I have to just do this way. This end of the section is open and round like this, and then you have the nib end on that side. Then you have this rod, which does have a seal, but it's not a seal that rests against the inside of the barrel. That would be a piston filler. And again, you draw up that piston, it creates a vacuum, it sucks up ink. Here, as you can see, let me show you that better. Where's my device? Here's my device. Let me clip this on. In a one-way shut-off valve, as you can see, this seal, it's moving, you see that? That does not touch the inside of the barrel at all. That's not what it's for. So we have this opening in the section. Again, nib is there. And then you have that rod. And that rod can come in, boom, like that. Okay? And then it shuts off the ink supply, which is in the barrel. You fill this with an eyedropper, ink, 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 ink. Now when I turn this, that puts that seal, it pushes it up, and that again seals up the section. That way no ink is coming out. This explanation is crucial, okay? Because this answers a couple of the questions that the user has about his pen. Because what he asks is it normal, there were a couple questions, is it normal for the feed to dry out when the pen is capped and the valve is shut? Yes, hence the name one-way shut-off valve, right? You block access to the nib unit with probably a collar, a feed, and a nib on top of that to the ink reservoir, right? The feed is there, the nib is there, the ink is here, they cannot communicate. That's the whole point. You shut it off. That way there's no leakage. But more importantly, you can regulate the wetness of that pen a bit. If I want to do that on my Emperor, as I am writing, I open up the back end. That way, that one-way shut-off valve is opened and ink can again flow out into the feed, pulled out into the nib slit onto the paper. So in other words, is it normal that when you shut off that valve that the feed dries out? Yes, because it has no more ink flow, so it may write for a little bit, but then it's going to stop. Now, it's possible, I don't know, I haven't scientifically investigated this. It's possible that some one-way shut-off valves don't operate like this, but like that. They leave a little bit of a gap and a little bit of ink can seep through. Well, in that case, I would not expect the feed to dry out completely, but it's probably still going to be a little dry because there's not much ink coming out. Remember that this is very different from cartridges, converters, piston fillers, bulk fillers, eyedroppers, because you have an ink reservoir that is continuously communicating with the nib and the feed. So if you have a cap that properly shuts off air, right, you should uncap it, you should be able to write straight away. But you've closed it, and when you close it, there ain't no ink coming out, right? That's point one. Second point was there was some concern about the number of turns that was required to make the pen write. Now, again, if I were to write with this pen like this, ink flow to the nib and feed is shut off, and therefore the pen will not write. It probably will write a little bit because there's a little bit of ink left in the feed, but at some point that runs out, the pen runs dry, it will not write again. It will not write anymore. At that point, I need to open up that valve. The more I open up the valve, the wetter the flow is going to be. If I put this all the way there, it's going to be incredibly wet. Nobody wants that, because once I push this in, even though that seal doesn't touch the inside of the barrel, it's still going to push a bit of air out, and you're going to get leakage, obviously. Clearly I'm exaggerating. Now, the person asked me, I have to turn it 4 or 5 times. Okay, let's try that. So that's a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5. And then it writes, is that too much? I don't think I've ever opened mine up that far, but does it really matter to you, right? People often overestimate how much wetter the pen will get. I mean, there is a bit of a physical limit to how wet it will really get. It's not going to go from a bone dry, extra fine needle point to a super wet triple broad. That's not what it's like. It will fluctuate a little bit in wetness. Now, having said that, is 4 turns too many? I suppose it depends a little bit on how exactly your specific emperor is constructed. It could matter, right? But I have the feeling there is something else going on. If there also is an issue with baby's bottom, you may really have to put a lot of ink through that nib and feed for that pen to write. Again, all the more reason to send that pen off to a nibmeister. Now, the final question was, the person was using Rhodia paper. I forget the exact ink. I may have a platinum carbon black. No, first Robert Oster ink, Rhodia paper, then platinum carbon black. This seemed to solve the hard start issues. Okay, Rhodia paper is coated paper. If you already have baby's bottom, that paper is going to exacerbate that problem because it is coated. And because of that coating, it is so smooth. But the smoother the paper is, the more pronounced the over-polishing of the nib, that is the baby's bottom problem, is going to be exacerbated because that nib is so over-polished, it looks like a baby's bottom, and therefore it doesn't fully touch the paper. More absorbent paper will be better in fixing, well, not fixing, but mitigating that issue. Very smooth paper, especially coated paper, is going to make it worse, not make the nib worse, but there is less absorbency to suck ink into that paper, right? So the Rhodia paper may not have been the best choice if there already is a baby's bottom issue. You've not done more damage to the pen. That's not what I'm saying, but I hope that story is clear. Robert Oster ink can have a lot of sheen. In my experience, sheening ink, I don't know if this was a sheening ink, but sheening ink can make a pen hard start. Now you have baby's bottom, potentially, coated paper, and what I'm guessing is sheening ink. That combination is probably not going to work very well. So again, send the pen to a nibmeister, have it fixed, and then you can use any ink and any paper you want. But right now, those factors are exacerbating the problem, because then you put in carbon ink, platinum carbon ink, and it was fine. So that has not eliminated the paper issue, that has not eliminated the baby's bottom, but I found that a fairly wet ink, in my recollection, that may have made the baby's bottom problem a little bit less pronounced. Final question that was asked is, does this pen only work with specific papers and inks? No, it does not. Any fountain pen should work with any fountain pen ink and any paper. But again, it sounds like there are other issues with the pen. I'm not going to belabor the point because this video is long enough. I think any of those issues will need fixing, and then it should work with any paper and ink combination. I always used to use Iroshizuku Tsutsuji in my Namiki Emperor. That is a lubricated ink, as the Iroshizukus are. Never had issues. Then I switched to Edelstein Star Ruby Red because I happen to have a lot of it and it's a fairly similar color. I've not had any issues. I don't think that ink is lubricated. I could be wrong. Those Edelstein inks often are quite wet. It's also a wet ink, but I've also put in other inks. One time I put in B.R.E Brown, which I don't think is excessively dry, but it's by no means a gusher of an ink. It's not lubricated. I had no issues. But if the nib is not tuned properly, well, then you're going to have issues. I hope that was clear and made sense and was useful, and I haven't bored you to death. Please let me know if any other questions arise, and I shall try to answer them to the best of my abilities. Tally ho! See you next time.